In our last session, we left Paul and the ship and all of the prisoners, the guards. They had just landed on the Isle of Malta. And I say landed, the ship did not. The ship broke up at sea. Everyone, as God had promised, everyone made it alive to the beach. And it turns out they were on the island of Malta. And they were there for approximately 3 months. It turns out they had to spend the entire rest of the winter season, the storm season, there on the island. And Luke tells us that the islanders, those people who lived there on the island of Malta, treated them with unusual kindness. Apparently, Luke and the people who were on the ship did not expect to be received as kindly and as welcomed as they were. But as soon as they landed, the islanders came out and they helped make a bonfire. Paul and the prisoners and the soldiers and the sailors would have been in the water. They were tired, they were cold, they were hungry, and the islanders helped make a bonfire. Paul, being Paul, was helping. Paul was out helping gather firewood to put on this bonfire when a snake bit him. Now, a couple of things to notice about this. The snake bit him hard enough and deep enough for the fangs to stick in his arm. That does not always happen. It says Paul shook the snake off, which means the snake did not let go by itself. The other thing to notice is the islanders recognized the snake. These are people who live on the island. They know the snakes that are there. They expected Paul to die from this poisonous snake bite. And so they sat back and watched. And their thought was, this man must be terrible. He must be an evil person because the gods have wrecked his ship. And then when he accidentally survived the shipwreck, the gods sent a poisonous snake to kill him. And so they waited for Paul, who they believed to be an evil man. They waited for Paul to die. When Paul did not die, he just shook the snake off and continued as if nothing had happened. The islanders changed their approach. Then they said, this must be a man of God. If God protected him from a shipwreck, and then God protected him from this poisonous snake, there must be something special about him. So they told the governor of the island, a man named Publius, and Paul and his companions then went to visit Publius. Publius had a father who was very sick. Paul, as Luke is showing us, the man of God, Paul, in the name of Christ, healed Publius' father. And then all of the other islanders started bringing their sick families to Paul. And Luke says Paul spent the next 3 months with these people. He healed them. Interestingly, Luke does not say that Paul preached. We assume he did. Everywhere that Paul went, Paul taught, Paul preached. But Luke does not explicitly say that. Once the 3 months had gone, after experiencing this welcome and kind environment that the islanders had created for Paul and everyone else, they booked passage on the next Alexandrian ship. The storms have now passed. It's time to take the grain on to Rome, and Paul and his companions and the soldiers are now on the next ship headed for Rome. Well, the ships don't actually sail to the city of Rome. Rome is inland, and you don't sail inland. They sailed to a small place called Puteoli, and they had made some stops along the way. But at Puteoli, they got off the ship, and they walked then the rest of the way up to Rome. And this was one of the major Roman highways. We've spoken in previous classes about Roman roads and how Rome had created these amazing roads, basically like highways, that you could travel very rapidly on, at least rapidly for the first century. They made the roads for the movement of their military, but everyone else could use the roads as well. And Paul and his companions and the soldiers were on one of these roads. It was called the Appian Way. That was simply the name of the road that they were on. And it was headed directly for Rome. By the time Paul is on this little Roman highway, the people along the way have started to hear that Paul was coming. And so people from Rome and other surrounding towns would come out to meet Paul and to hear from him, and presumably he would stop long enough to teach. The Roman centurion is giving him opportunity. They would stay in towns longer than they might otherwise, and the Roman centurion is giving Paul plenty of opportunity to stay, to talk, to teach, to meet with people as they slowly make their way along this road on the coast to Rome. When they got to Rome finally, Paul was allowed to rent a home. He's not thrown into jail. He is a Roman citizen who is accused of a crime but has not yet been convicted. So Paul is under house arrest. He's chained to a Roman soldier, so he was always connected to a guard, but he is allowed to rent a home to live in while he waits for his trial. And apparently he rented a home large enough not just to stay in, but also to hold meetings in. It appears that he planted a church right there in his own home. A few days after he arrived, he invited the Jewish leaders from Rome to come and visit with him. And they came, and he explained some things about what was happening. He talked to them about why he was in Rome, what the charges were against him, that he was going to be facing trial with the Supreme Court there in Rome. And the Jewish leaders had not heard anything about Paul, which is unusual at the time, but they were very interested in what he had to say. So they came back again the next day to spend the whole day with him, learning about what he was teaching, learning about what was happening in the rest of the Roman Empire. And it says they brought many other leaders. So a lot of the Jewish leaders from Rome had come now to hear Paul teach. They said, "We want to hear what your views are on all of these things." Well, they came back the next day in larger numbers, and Paul began to teach. And as always happened when Paul taught, his audience was with him until he got to the part of the mystery. And you'll remember the great mystery for Paul was that everyone is saved based on their faith in Christ, Jews and Gentiles alike. The Gentiles could come to God through their faith in Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. They did not have to become Jewish to do so. That, of course, is where Paul always ran into trouble with his audiences. Some people then believe that Jesus was the Messiah and put their faith in him. Others want to hear more. Still others reject the message, and usually their rejection comes at the point where Gentiles are allowed to have faith in Christ. For many of the Jews in the first century, that was just very confusing and seemed just wrong. So they rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and then they rejected the idea that other people, non-Jews, could have a right relationship with God without becoming Jewish. Well, he stayed there and planted a house church, it appears. And Luke says that he then spent the next 2 years preaching boldly and without hindrance. In other words, even though he was under house arrest, Paul preached, he taught. He used the opportunities that God presented to him to spread the gospel. And no one hindered him. He was not stopped from doing so. However, for our sense of curiosity, for our sense of what happens next, Luke ends the book of Acts rather abruptly. It simply says that Paul, for the next 2 years, was there and preached boldly without hindrance, and then Luke stops writing. Now, I want to know what happened next. I want Luke to keep writing, but Luke simply stops there. And we then have to look at other places, other books in the Bible, to find out what happened next. What we do know is that Paul, in addition to his other preaching and teaching and whatever else he was doing there under house arrest, Paul wrote letters. This is something he has done for his entire ministry career. He writes letters of encouragement, of correction, of teaching to all of the churches that he's visited. And we know that while Paul was under house arrest in those 2 years, he wrote letters. Very specifically, we know, among other letters, that he wrote to the Colossians, he wrote to the Ephesians, he wrote to the Philippians, and he wrote to a friend by the name of Philemon. We'll look at those in another class from other parts of history, as well as from some of the other books in the Bible that we'll talk about in future classes. We know that at the end of the 2 years, Paul was released. Had Paul been found guilty, he would have been jailed or potentially executed. Paul was released at the end of those 2 years. Luke does not write that, but as I said, we'll talk in another class about what happened. In our next class, we're going to talk about the letters that he wrote to those churches.